So thanks for attending our session on field trials for our recycling contamination project. We are recording this session so that we can share it with people who couldn't make the session today. Obviously, if there's anything at any time that you're uncomfortable, we can always pause the recording if that's necessary. So we're going to go through three things today. We're going to look at just a bit of background about BehaviourWorks and where this project has come from. We're going to look at the idea of the field trials in general and the types of things that we're looking at, and then more specifically about what's actually involved in being a delivery partner. Like I said, deja vu for those of you who are just on the call for the online session. This beginning bit is exactly the same. We'll have time during the, oops, I can't get my screen to move. There we go. Time set aside throughout the presentation to get any questions from you guys, but please do stop me also at any time if you have questions about what I'm talking about at any time. So a bit of background on the project. So BehaviourWorks is a research centre at Monash University. We're looking specifically at behaviour change of individuals, employees, business leaders, policymakers to obviously achieve better outcomes. We do a number of, we work in a number of different ways. So we do individual projects looking at particular problems or issues and how we can use behaviour science to improve that. We work on an ongoing basis with a number of partners, and we also run a series of education and training, workshops and deliver online and face-to-face kind of training. And we work across a whole range of different areas, but obviously the team that I'm in and what's most interesting to us is our waste area. And so BehaviourWorks, like I said, works often through partnerships as well as through one-off projects. And so we have a large number of partners that we do work with, including the consortium is what we call some of our our founding partners who are part of our steering committee. So that includes the environment agencies at the Commonwealth, New South Wales and Victorian levels, the Shannon Company, which is a behaviour change communication, and Vic Roads. And we've done a lot of work with other government departments and with private companies. I think we can share some information about the type of work that we do in the past. But the way we approach our process is through a behavioural science approach, and we've developed over the last 10 years and over hundreds of projects what we call the method, BehaviourWorks method. And it had 3 phases to it, and the first phase is to look quite in depth at a particular problem to understand what's actually going on, the whole system that's involved, who's part of that system, or what's going on, to collate any evidence and any prior research that's done and start to identify the particular behaviours of different groups within that system that might be either causing troubles and problems or perhaps demonstrating the ideal behaviours that we want people to adopt. And from that, we go into a deep dive to look at those behaviours in more detail to understand what's driving problematic behaviours or perhaps what's preventing ideal behaviours from being adopted. Again, we talk to people, we look at what we know about behaviour in general, we review prior evidence, and we start to collate some ideas of what might work to address that. And then we move into the application phase where we look at, how could we actually trial some of these ideas and evaluate them to actually see what does work. And we try and adopt, as I said, a fairly scientific approach to that, to actually testing at a fairly quantitative level to be able to get a certain level of confidence in the results and to know what's likely to work going forward. And this particular project comes out of the Waste and Circular Economy collaboration, which is a really exciting initiative by BehaviourWorks. It's the first time we've tried a collaboration of this nature, and it builds on a whole parcel of past waste research that we've done. So there's been over 8 projects that BehaviourWorks has looked at different issues around waste, including certain types of policies like the ag bans and deposit schemes, and particular topics like food waste or litter. And in this case, particularly recycling contamination. And one of the things that we've done as part of these projects is actually done reviews of existing evidence to say what do we know does actually work or not work in these particular spaces. But what's been really interesting in this waste space, which is quite different from some of the other spaces that BehaviourWorks works in, that the overall conclusion that has come out of these reviews is that there's actually not very much evidence out there published in a published form about what does actually work to change people's behaviours, to get better waste outcomes. And so the waste and circular economy collaboration was kind of formed out of that kind of experience of working with a number of our partners, particularly, like I said, Commonwealth, Victorian and New South Wales governments, to say, well, what could we do to actually improve this state, and to actually develop some evidence about some of the pressing waste problems that we have. And so the partners got together and said, what are the things that seem to be of most import or most interest, or potentially for the future? And there was kind of 3 projects that came out of that. Obviously, this one on commingled yellow bin recycling and contamination, but also 2 other projects related more generally to the circular economy, to kind of a broader circular economy. So one of them is business adoption of circular economy approaches, and the other is the use of product labels to influence both consumer and producer behaviours. And so they're pieces of work, those 2, that are going on kind of in parallel to this project, and there'll be information coming out about those also in the not too distant future. But on the recycling contamination project, what we've already done is we've done another kind of scoping interviews where we've talked to some of our government agencies, as well as the waste industry, environmental agencies, and also read a number of the research that's been done by councils, and published research and evaluation reports, and so looked at some of that grey literature, and then also scanned sort of all of the academic literature out there from around the world to see what we know about being able to change recycling behaviour. And a similar kind of thing, as we said, that there doesn't seem to be a lot of strong evidence out there. So we agreed that the next stage was to actually try and create some of that evidence ourselves. So we've moved into the trial phase of the project, where what we're doing now is looking to recruit partners, such as organisations like yourselves, where we will then actually go and test some of the things that seem like they might work to change behaviour, and actually gather a strong evidence that we can then disseminate more broadly to help move along, I guess, kind of approaches to waste behaviour change. And at the end, we'll kind of do that dissemination through a kind of a series of policy forums where we actually share what we've learned much more broadly across Australia. And as part of this project and the scoping piece of work that we did, one of the things was we looked at much more detail about, we know contamination is an issue, but what is contamination, and what do we mean when we're talking about contamination? And one of the things that we found, which won't be a surprise to anyone here, is that why something gets called a contaminant can be quite different depending on the item. So some things are considered contaminants because they're just generally unrecyclable. Other things are technically recyclable but have no value to anyone at the moment. So MRFs can't get any sort of price for selling those on, so they don't want them. Other things potentially could be recycled, but our current sorting systems can't sort them into the right streams. So they end up, either falling into holes and damaging the equipment, or getting into other streams and actually downgrading those streams. And there's a bunch of other reasons that things might not belong in the yellow bin. There's obviously danger and hazards to people sorting as well. And the other thing that was quite interesting was that, obviously, again, no surprise, but there's a real lack of consistency about what is and isn't accepted in the yellow bin across councils, even in the same regions in some cases, particularly in New South Wales. Possibly the same in Victoria, and this can have to do with the types of facilities that you have available for collection and processing, whether they're hand or machine sorted, what type of machinery is available, even sometimes just how recent the collections or the processing contract is, can all determine what gets considered contamination or not contamination in a yellow bin. So one of the things that we did then was decide what we were actually going to focus on in these trials. And so we looked across a whole range of kind of research, particularly in New South Wales and Victoria, individual councils and at the state level, about what the main contaminants seem to be. And knowing that we needed to focus a little bit, we've kind of tentatively selected the 3 contaminants that we're going to focus on. So one is bagged recyclables, obviously placing recyclables inside a plastic bag. The second is loose soft plastics, placing, you know, bread bags, pasta bags, plastic bags, for example, into the recycling. And then finally, placing recyclable items into the recycling bin still with food or liquid inside them. And these different items relate to different types of behaviours. So obviously, bagging recyclables is about how people collect them, whether they collect them in a crate or a bag, for example, where in their house potentially, and how much space they have to collect them. Loose soft plastic is much more about a sorting decision. Aside from those people who do have red cycle collections, it's a question about which bin do they put it in. Do they put it in the rubbish bin or the recycling bin? And then food and liquid is obviously about preparation. So what do they do with items before they put them in the bin? And so hopefully by selecting these different types of contaminants at the end of the trials, we'll have evidence about what works for different types of behaviours, which can then hopefully be applied to other contaminants of a similar nature to these. So for example, if something works to help you empty, you know, scrape some food out of it, potentially it might also work if you need people to take lids off things first, or perhaps put lids back on things depending on where you are and what your processor likes. So they're the kind of 3 items that we're probably going to trial. So they're the 3 that we're going to trial. Whether we can trial all 3 or whether we need to choose 2 of those 3 or even just one of those 3 will depend on how many interested partners we have and the interest of those partners. Any questions? That's just a bit of a general context. So for those of you who have just joined us, any questions just about how we've come to this point now before we go into more detail about what it will actually look like for you? No? No questions? Okay, I just want to give you a quick high-level overview of when we talk about trials, kind of what we mean. And this is kind of a fairly conceptual introduction to a trial for those of you who aren't really familiar with it, but we'll look in much more detail at kind of the nitty-gritty of what they might actually look like on the ground with you in a second. But at a high level, the idea of a trial is designing a project that will actually let us test whether or not something works. So the idea is that you actually get a group of people and you randomly split them into different groups so that, you know, each of the groups are fairly similar. And then you do different things with those groups. So for example, for some of those groups, you might try a particular type of intervention. And that intervention could be, for example, an education campaign where you letterbox some flyers or you knock on people's doors. It might be a broadcast advertising campaign where you, put on social media and radio and potentially TV and billboards and things like that, more broadcast sort of messages. They might be kind of structural or system changes where you're actually looking at the sort of bins that are available. There's a whole host of other things that we could do, but you pick different things and you do them with different groups of people. And then you also have groups where you don't do anything. And then what you do is after you've tried some of your interventions with people, you go and measure the outcomes for all of your different groups. So you can actually see what happens, what's going on with groups where you're not doing anything. What does it actually look like? And then how different are the other groups where you have intervened? Are they significantly different and hopefully significantly better than your group where you did nothing? And so, for example, in this kind of conceptual example, you might find that, in your control group, when you measure it, you might find that, say 2 houses out of your group improved and 2 houses didn't improve and 4 kind of stayed the same. So we just know that what goes in the bin changes from, week to week and month to month and who's doing the recycling. So there's always a bit of variation. So our second group, where we tried intervention 2, what we can see is that it's not that much different to the control group. So we might consider that this could actually just be a random, artifact of the people that we have in that group, or it might be a very, very small impact. But in the top one, we can see that's really quite different to the results that we got in the control group. So we'd be quite confident that what we did in the first intervention actually had a real effect. And so the idea of a trial is designing the project in a particular way that actually allows us to run some statistical analysis to determine how confident we are that an intervention had a particular effect. And the idea of doing this is actually, hopefully, to get some data that will actually help councils do things like make real business cases about decisions to go ahead with particular things. So for example, if you could invest these sorts of resources, you could, potentially expect this sort of change in contamination or, you know, whatever else it is. So that's just a really high level idea about trials, and there's different ways of doing them. This is just one, like I said, at a conceptual level. But before we move on, are there any questions at this high level about what we're talking about when we're talking about trials? We've only got a couple of people with their videos on, and I can see them shaking their head. So I'm going to use them as the litmus test for whether other people have questions. But if you don't have your video on, like I said, please do jump up at any time, type into the chat if you don't want to interrupt, or just turn your microphone on and ask your questions as we go through. So as I mentioned, or as you might have seen in the emails, we're actually looking at two types of experiments. So we're looking at online experiments, and then we're looking at real field trials. So for those of you who weren't here in our first session for online experiments, just a really high level overview of what we're looking at doing. They're sort of really preliminary tests about what types of messaging or materials might work to change behaviour, and they're obviously preliminary because they're online. We don't actually get to check what happens to actual behaviours or to actual waste in the bin. But it gives us a quick and easy way of getting some ideas about what might work. And there's two ways that we can test, or that we will be testing those. One is kind of through panel surveys, and the other is through Facebook advertising. And, you know, we, for example, could test different types of systems and see whether having more or less bins, for example, increased source separation actually helps people sort better, or whether providing information in a particular way, like on a flyer, whether certain types of information or messages or ways of visually portraying the information makes it easier for people to remember. On Facebook, we obviously can test different types of messages and visuals. So just a really high level at the system, at the survey level, what we're talking about is the idea that you would give people some questions where they actually have to try and sort materials just out of their own knowledge. And we, in the back end, see how many of those they get right. And then we present them some sort of information, which might be for a flyer or a new bin setup, for example, and then we represent the same questions to them, and we check whether they're better able to sort the same items the second time around based on whatever it is we gave them, compared to when they were just doing it from what they already knew. And you might test different types of things. So you might try, you know, flyers that have just instructions on them about this can go in and this can't go in. There might be other flyers that have, you know, quite persuasive messages about how important it is to get it right and to pay attention, or, you know, sort of if in doubt, leave it out messages, and see whether any of those different things come up with different results when they go to sort the second time. And similarly, on Facebook, we might use the Facebook advertising platform to actually show different groups of people within communities, different variations, and then see when people, whether people interact with those in different ways, whether people are more likely to like or to share or to click through to whatever the particular action is. So the session recording, so the recording of the online session will be available after tomorrow for anyone who didn't attend that session or isn't attending it tomorrow, to see what's involved in case you're also interested in those. But what we're really interested in today, obviously, is the field trials. So these are the real engagement with communities. The first thing I want to go through is kind of the types of things we might be testing. So the types of approaches of engaging with people or trying to change behaviour. And, you know, the idea of a field trial is that this is a real test. You're actually out there with your community in some way, shape or form, or with probably part, generally speaking, part of your community. And there's three types of things that we're kind of interested in testing. And the first one is looking at kind of the standard education approach, which most councils use some form of traditional education, which might be letterboxing of flyers or bin stickers or signs, for example, and whether there's things that we can learn from theory or from best practice examples around the country where we can apply behavioural sciences to that traditional education and see if we can get more of an impact through those standard approaches. The second option is to, sorry, I keep clicking on the wrong place, is to see whether we can validate approaches that actually seem to be quite promising that councils might be doing on their own and feeling like it's actually delivering them the results that they want, but they haven't evaluated or been able to publish the evidence out there to actually share with other people. So for example, bin tagging is a really good example of that, where there's lots of really common to find councils who say this is really effective for us, but there's no published information about how effective it is or how what sort of level of change you can expect. So it's quite hard for other councils to do a business case to say, well, if we invest this level of resources in a program, we could expect this change in contamination, for example. Or if we're going to do this, we need to make sure that we actually do it for 4 months rather than just 2 months, or all that sort of information that can kind of help councils decide how and when to adopt particular approaches. There's other ones that we'll look at in more detail. And then the third type of thing that we're trying is actually what we're kind of calling novel options, which might be being done here or there, but aren't very common, or perhaps are coming directly from ideas and theories that people have about what might actually work. And so the types of things that we would actually do in eventual field trials are likely to be some of these, but also the ideas that our interested delivery partners actually come to the table with. So we're quite open on what we would look at. But again, just as a bit of an idea of the types of things that we're thinking about. So these are the things that have come out of our interviews with councils and other partners. And we're interested in your thoughts on these and also other ideas that you have. So for example, we're talking about applying behavioural insights to traditional education approaches. So whether, different types of messages or designs can actually create larger change or be more effective across the whole population. So for example, a really common thing is bin stickers. So we might look at whether, the idea of bin wraps, which are more salient, present more information in a larger format, might be more effective than the standard bin stickers or bin posters that we use. Where we place stickers, whether it's on the top of the lid or under the lid, around the body, for example, on the bin bay wall. So testing different ways of actually putting information on the bins and see whether any of those grab people's attention, hold that attention, and actually lead to change. Again, also looking at letterbox materials like flyers, for example, or even fridge calendars. And we would use some of the learnings from our online experiments about what type of messages and visuals seem to resonate, and then use them to potentially come up with different types of flyers and say, do we know whether, providing information in certain ways or certain types of information, like having both the red and yellow, or just focusing on the yellow, for example, is more effective, or if we have kind of more persuasive or single issue. So rather than trying to say, here's everything that is and isn't recyclable, what happens if we just focus on one thing like bag recyclables and just push it? Can we get more impact that way? And so again, just testing different types of traditional approaches and seeing whether there's ways to make them better. And obviously there's a whole host of other types of education that councils are doing, but this is just to give you an idea of what we're thinking about in this education stream. So the types of things that most councils are out there doing anyway. Is there anything we can learn that can help councils be doing that better? I'm just going to take a little drink. I've been talking for an hour and a half. So that's the first type of trial that we're interested in exploring around education. The second one is around what we're calling validation. So like I said, this is where councils are telling us that actually they have some things that they think works, but we can't find any strong evidence that we can use to then share more broadly. So for example, we might look at bin inspection, which is bin tagging or letterboxing of postcards based on kind of visual inspections of bins, and seeing again whether there's things about the way the tags are designed, how frequently the tags are put out there, for how long duration the program has to run to get results and to actually keep those results, into the future after the bin tagging is stopped. So whether we can learn, and collect evidence about, this works and this doesn't work, or this works better when you do it this way, for example. Also looking for those councils who are lucky enough to be having some of the new truck technology where they actually feel that the data they're getting back is reliable. There's obviously really exciting potential for track cameras to reduce the cost of data collection, because you don't actually need to be out there digging through bins at 4 a.m. in the morning. But there's other issues around this. A lot of councils who've tried this, things like actually getting truck drivers to actually reliably use the system and report, for example. So some of these trials might be less around how effective is it in changing resident behaviour, but might be more about what does a council need to do to actually get truck drivers and their behaviour on board in order to be able to collect this data better, and then use that data to then communicate with their households. And do you do that, for example, by sending letters to people when the truck has identified them, or do you go and door knock? So there's options there to explore. There's other kind of things that some councils have been finding really useful. So a couple of councils have adopted approaches where they really personalise their MRF sorting team to say, hey, there's people on the other end of this, and this is how your choices impact us. So there's some really interesting behavioural insights there that could potentially be really effective. There's the idea of pledges, getting people to make commitments. So questions around, how resource intensive is it to actually get out to your community to get pledges? What types of pledges? What do you do with those pledges? What makes them effective? And even little things like, some experiment that one particular council did when they were trying to reduce bagged recyclables was actually to cut these square holes in the top of bin lids. And they actually found that seemed to be quite effective in reducing the incidence of bagged recyclables when it was combined with postcards, for example. So could we replicate that and see if other apartment buildings having problems with bagged recyclables, do they get the similar positive outcomes over and over again? Is this a really simple way potentially? Or was it just something that was going on, in that particular community at the time, and perhaps interacting with a much broader campaign that they were doing? So the idea of this one is to take things that councils think are working, but we don't have a lot of confident data behind that, and to basically test them across a number of different communities and see how strong is the evidence that these work generally speaking. And then the final group is kind of, again, what we're talking about, novel approaches. So not necessarily new, definitely, ideas that are coming from councils who are trying really cool things out there that they might have, come up with yourself, or, heard an idea and tried it out. For example, one of the things that we saw in the ACT was that they actually tried to get building managers to do the feedback. So the council did the inspections, but the building manager actually gave the feedback to residents via an internal notice board. Obviously, some councils have been using for quite some time recycling apps, but there's new ones coming out, particularly in New South Wales, specifically around reducing contamination. So going beyond just the when's my bin night and stuff, and trying to get people to actually use an app to check. And then even things like the idea of using floor decals, for example, in apartment buildings has been quite effective in commercial spaces. And so whether it might have similar impacts in apartment buildings, where they're actually putting material on the floor rather than the walls, given that what we know about people as they walk is they tend to look down as they're going to places rather than up. So that idea of, again, harvesting ideas from people and seeing what does the theory suggest is likely to be effective, and can we try that and see if it happens in reality. So these are all just, like I said, illustrative examples, the types of ideas that have been coming through our initial research. But before we move on to how it will actually work, I'd just be interested if anybody has any questions or even any ideas about these types of things that we might trial in the field trials. Nope, happy to move on to the nitty-gritty of how this will actually work for your council if there's not any questions. I just like to talk, so I just want to make sure that I give a chance for anyone else to talk in the meantime, and that I don't just keep rolling on if people are like, oh, but. So I will keep moving. So talking about the actual trial process, like I said, I gave a kind of an overview of the concept of a trial before, but there's different ways that we might do this in practice. So there are, what we would call randomized control trials, and this is where you literally take the population, this is what we looked at before, and you split it into two groups. You give an intervention to some of those groups and you don't give an intervention to some of the other groups, and then you measure across all of them and you try and see if there's any differences between them. You may or may not do a baseline for all of the groups beforehand, or you just might measure them all at one point. Sometimes it depends on the type of data you're collecting and sample size. But so for this type of trial, it might be one council trialling one thing in their community, and they have a control group and kind of what we call intervention groups within their community, or it might be multiple trials, multiple councils who are trialing the same thing, and each council might be its own group. And then we measure whether there's differences between councils, for example, to say, does this work not just across a particular community within a council, but actually across councils with different characteristics, and we start to get bigger pictures of what's working. Another type of trial is kind of what we call a time series trial, and this is where you know again you might have your groups where one or more groups gets an intervention and another group doesn't, but what you actually do is you actually measure data continuously across a period. So like, for example, with the truck technology, we might be collecting the data every fortnight, you know, for a group of councils, and actually seeing what happens over a whole period. Depending on, some councils have already invested in resources for visual inspections, so you might do a couple before you do the big education campaign, some in the middle of the education campaign, and then some at the end, for example, and we actually start to see whether over time we can see any changes in patterns. Or the kind of more standard trial, which is gives kind of, in one sense, the least reliable data, but sometimes is just more feasible to go ahead, is where you do a before and after trial. So you measure what's going on for a particular group of, you know, households, then you try something with them, and then you measure again. And so this is, you know, potentially things like visual inspections, where you actually go and look in all the bins for a number of houses, you know, across an area, and you get a sense for, you know, what level of a particular contaminant, for example, how common are bagged recyclables across this thing, and then you do, you know, whatever the intervention is about cutting holes in the bin lids or delivering flyers or whatever it is, and then you measure again and say, does that appear to have reduced the number of bagged recyclables in the bins over that period. So there's different ways that we can organise the trials, and some of these produce better results than others, but obviously the more data you have to collect, the more expensive it is for your council, because the data collection costs are one of the things that we ask the delivery partners to contribute. So we'll do all the analysis, as well as, and we'll talk about this later, obviously help with the design. But so one of the things that we'll be doing once we get a sense of who's interested is actually finding out what sort of ways can you collect data on actual behaviours and actual changes in the bin, because that's the most reliable type of data. And so how might we design the project to help us get that data? But definitely, and this comes back to the point that we had in the previous info session, that what we measure, like for example, the number of bags of recyclables in the bin, or the weight of soft plastics, for example, is really important, and how we collect that data is going to be really critical to whether at the end we can confidently say this works, or this works better than this, or this works better when you do this way, for example. And so, you know, talking about measurement, and again, this gets discussed in much more detail with the people who are actually interested in going ahead with this, but there's different ways of collecting kind of the waste data. So there's actually video footage, which is in one sense much less resource intensive and costly when the right cameras are kind of in place and when they're used properly. There's also actual audits, whether they're truck audits or bin audits. Then there's inspections and surveys, and you can measure waste contaminants in different ways. So you can count the number of contaminants, you can weigh them, you can just see whether or not they're present in the number of households that are actually putting them in the bin, for example. And you can work out whether you're measuring just a particular item like bagged recyclables, or getting a sense of the whole level of contamination within a bin. But what we know is that some methods actually produce more reliable data than other methods, but there's always a pragmatic element to this. So this is part of the conversation that we have with interested trials about what is actually feasible for your council to do, and for other councils, and how could we construct a trial that's going to give us some confidence at the end about what did work and what's likely to work in other situations. So that's just kind of an overview of the trials themselves as we kind of see them. What we'll do next is talk about what would actually be required of partners or of organisations to be delivery partners on the trials. But before I move on, are there any questions about the trials themselves and how they might work in general? I've only got 2 videos, so I can see those people very kindly shaking their heads and saying, no, we've got it. There's a number of other people on the line. If you just want to pipe up and just let me know that you're still there, and that this is making sense and you're happy to go ahead.
yeah, I'm still here, and that it all makes sense. So happy to keep going.
Thanks, Bernadette.
All good from me.
Okay, thanks guys. We'll keep moving on then if there's no other questions, and talk about what's actually involved in being a partner. So obviously we think that there are a number of benefits that would come to you, to your organisations, to being a partner on us, and these are the types of things that we kind of sent out. If you've seen the email or the website, you obviously get a chance to learn from the research that we've already collected and from the research that you guys would be part of about what works. You get to test that in your own community, so it's not just kind of general results. It says, you know, in New South Wales this seems to work in these types of communities. You actually know and have evidence for your own. You get to work with me and our other behavioural scientists to actually design approaches, so learn what we take into account when we do that, what research is available, what other best practice and case studies are out there that you can draw on, not just for this but into the future. You do actually basically get free evaluation services, so we help with the design of the intervention. You guys do go away and implement it, but then you give the data to us and we actually do the analysis, and you actually get a summary report just for your council based on your trial results, as well as the full trial reporting for everyone that's involved. And obviously there's kind of reputational benefits to that as well. So we'll obviously promote everyone who's partnering with us, and you get to say that you're part of what really is kind of really groundbreaking research, looking at a really systematic way about what can work for contamination. So we think there's a number of benefits to you guys to be involved, and hopefully you do too, which is why you're on the call here today. But there are some things that we obviously need from our partners in order to make this work. So again, the things that we kind of shared, the first one is that we need you to be able to agree to deliver whatever it is that we design together, and that you deliver it faithful to that design so that we know what we are measuring. That you guys actually provide the staff to implement things on the ground and to do the data collection and cover the costs of any of the actual interventions, whether there's comms materials, different types of infrastructure. If you're actually sending someone out to cut holes in the bin lids, for example, you cover those costs. And finally, that you agree that all of the results from the research can actually be made public, because one of the things about the collaboration here is we obviously want to create evidence that everyone can access. But that being said, you know, we can obviously present the information in an anonymous way so that councils aren't identified in that, if that's important. But so you guys deliver the actual interventions, but we help with the design and with the analysis of those as part of the partnership. Any questions on that? It's quite high level because what's actually involved will come down to what particular type of intervention you nominate to be part of and how it actually looks at the design. But are there any questions about what's required of you to be a delivery partner?
Jenny, have you got any idea what the cost might be for the comms materials and incentives?
Look, it would come down to whatever was selected. So, for example, you know, we might be talking about at a minimum, if you were doing, for example, some sort of traditional education, which might involve letterboxing, that, you know, you might be doing 300 or 500 households, depending on what sort of data collection that you're doing. So it would be the cost of designing and printing those flyers. So it would be kind of a standard education or engagement campaign that you were doing for a population. And what we would ask from our delivery partners is what sort of resources would you have available to invest, and we would try and match that up to the types of interventions. So some councils are very lucky that they're actually at the beginning of designing a contamination phase, and this would be potentially the first step of that, and they've got quite a large budget available to invest in trialling something. Other councils are just really keen to be part of it because they're desperate to know what works, but they don't have kind of, you know, a big budget set aside, and so there'll be ways to design little things that people can be part of. So it's really hard to give an estimate in this particular case, because it really comes down to what councils are keen to try and how ambitious councils want to be, and whether you have resources in-house to do, for example, design, or whether you have to get externals in.
Yep.
Any other questions about what's required? what I'll do is then I'll go on to some of the other information about how the rest of the process works. So just a really approximate time frame. So we start with kind of a co-design workshop at the end of November, December, where interested people turn up literally, and we have these questions about what do we want to do and how would it look like and how much would that actually cost and is that feasible? How could we design something that is affordable but still, will provide us evidence at the end of it? Then we actually enter into agreements with individual delivery partners, because there obviously are going to be questions about in-kind and cash contributions. So we'll actually deliver up an agreement about exactly what you can expect from us as part of being a partner and what you will contribute to the project. Hopefully that won't take too long to wrap up, and we'll actually begin sort of planning the implementation. So working with you about what does it actually look like, which houses or apartment buildings are you going to go to on what days at what times, all of those proliferate questions that comes up when you're actually trying to design a program. And then at a very high level, we'll be looking at implementing the trials kind of likely between February and May next year, but depending again on the type of intervention, there may be much more implementation planning needed, and so the trial might start later, or they might only run for a short period of time depending on what they are. So that's, again, fairly open to both council needs, but also what's selected. Then we'll obviously be collecting all that data and doing the analysis towards May or June next year, and hopefully in June culminating in a series of policy forums, which is where we're actually sharing the evidence of what we've learned from these field trials, from the online experiments, and also from those other circular economy projects that we talked about that I mentioned right back at the beginning. So we'll be trying to disseminate basically as far and wide all of the evidence that we've collected. So at the same time that we're doing these field trials, as I said, those online experiments will also be happening, and these other projects. So in terms of the next steps for actually confirming who wants to be a delivery partner on this project, the first step is kind of an EOI form, an expression of interest, where we'll actually just ask you to tell us a little bit about what your current situation is, what you're interested in being part of, and then everyone who's interested will be invited to attend a co-design workshop. There'll be one in Sydney. I forgot to mention this actually in the last session, but there'll be one in Sydney and one in Melbourne, and there'll be opportunities for people to zoom in, whether for regional New South Wales or Victorian people or for people outside those two states. And in those co-design workshops, one again for the focusing on both the online comms and on the field trials, we'll be going into that level of detail about what does it actually look like, what do people actually want to do, and how would we do that. Once we've done the co-design workshop, like I said, the final step is the agreement between us and individual organisations, and then we'll end up with a list of delivery partners. So we'll send the form out at the end of the info sessions tomorrow to everyone who's registered for one of these info sessions. You fill it out, and we ask you to make an in good faith agreement to be a delivery partner. But we obviously understand that at this point it's very vague. You don't know what's involved and what would be asked of your council. So it's not a legally binding commitment in the EOI form. It's just a commitment that you will work with us throughout this process. And if at the end we reach agreement on something that is feasible for your council, that you will follow through on that. Then at the co-design workshop, we'll actually, like I said, define the particular trial, but you'll obviously need to go back and then confirm that with your council. We'll also do a shortlisting process where we look at all of the ideas that came up in that trial and the councils, the partners that are interested in those, and we'll get a shortlist out of those that we think we can feasibly do in the time frame. And then, like I said, we do the agreement. So the first step is this expression of interest form. Like I said, we'll email it around. It's a Word document. It is actually really long, but it's mostly just check boxes. So it's just for you to go through and select, what types of things you're interested in. And then there are boxes where you can add additional information if you like. But so it's long, but it should actually be fairly quick to fill out. And like I said, we do ask for someone with the appropriate delegation to sign that form as this agreement that you would participate if we can reach agreement on something that suits your council's context, but this is not a legally binding document. So you're not bound to anything by signing this form. And then we go to the co-design workshop phase, and this is something that we think will be of value, generally speaking, to council. So you come along, we give you a bit of the context, and we actually go into depth about the research that we've done, what we've found out about what does and doesn't work. we'll look at these types of trials, and we'll actually start to form teams of counsellors that are interested in exploring the same things, so we can get you together to start working out what you might be able to do together, to select particular approaches, and then actually start brainstorming what they could look like. Do a bit of a prioritisation, so you might be interested in a number of different trials because, you know, lots of different things seem good, so we'll ask, you know, to get your feedback on which particular things seem most relevant or interesting to you. We'll do some of the evaluation planning to make sure that we would actually be able to get reliable data on these interventions in your council, and then we'll sort of come to a bit of a conclusion about that. And then, like I said, we take that into the shortlisting process. So for the online experiments, which is what we covered off earlier, in one sense, there's no limit on the number of delivery partners we can have with that. So anyone who's interested in that, who can come reach agreement on what we do, can be accepted into that. With the field trials, it's a much harder question to answer. We don't even know exactly how many delivery partners we could take on, because again, it comes down to whether or not we do some really big, ambitious trials in just a couple of places, or whether we can do some smaller trials that are easily replicated across a number of different areas. Very gut feel, because we haven't done anything like this before, but we think that it would probably end up being less than 10. It could be as few as 4 or 5, depending on how ambitious we are for the actual field trials. So at the end of the workshop, what we'll do is we'll actually look at all of the kind of almost ideas or you know, things that have come up from partners, and we'll actually review them based on a number of criteria. So we'll look at things like how likely is that particular intervention to be able to be delivered in that 4 to 5 month time frame, realistically, based on experiences of trying to do this in the past. How confident are we that councils will actually be able to collect reliable data for this, that will actually measure what's the impact of this particular intervention on behaviour compared to anything else that might be going on. We'll look at whether or not any interventions are really tailored to one particular type of contaminant, or whether they're more likely to be generalisable to other issues, so that it's got greater applicability. And also, you know, how scalable is the intervention? How feasible is it that most local governments could actually adopt this if it turned out to be effective? So we'll do some kind of process to, you know, assess these, and from that kind of create this short list of trials that we think are going to give us the best bang for buck going forward. And then we'll begin that kind of contract negotiation with the partners for those trials. For those who are not selected, we still think there will have been benefits in leading up to that process, because you will have been able to attend the co-design forum. You'll be exposed to that research and the process of actually brainstorming and designing, and hopefully come away with lots of new ideas about things that you could be doing in your council anyway. And obviously, if we are able to secure additional funding to do further phases of this research, we would obviously be coming back to all of the interested organisations from this round before we went out for future rounds. So it's likely that a number of organisations who are interested in the field trials won't end up getting to partner on the project, because the resources that we have, while considerable, are not unlimited. But we do hope that there would be value in everyone, and even just going through this process with us, even if in the end you weren't selected as a delivery partner. So that's kind of just an overview of the process of selecting delivery partners. Are there any questions at this stage about how you guys sign up and how we move forward from here?
Nope.
Well, that kind of brings us to the end of the presentation. So are there any questions at all? Like I said, the next step is we send out the form at the end of tomorrow. We obviously send these slides definitely along with that, and there'll actually be a recording for anyone who wasn't able to make it today. So if you have other team members, for example, you'll be able to show them any of this information. But are there any other questions before we wrap up for the afternoon? Otherwise, 5 minutes. Linda.
I think it looks great, Jenny. We have a meeting coming up on Thursday, our regional education network meeting, and I think this would be great to discuss there. We do have some budget put aside to specifically do a behaviour change project for reducing contamination in recycling. So I think this is something for us to perhaps consider, and I think it all looks great. It kind of skips us forward a few steps if we participate in this, but it won't be my decision to make. But thanks for a great presentation.
Thanks, Linda. Any other questions before we finish up? Obviously, you've got my email. You can also contact me specifically about filling out the EOI form or any other questions that come to you. Otherwise, we'll finish up for today. Okay, thanks, guys. Oh, thanks, Alex. Alex has got some clapping hands on there because he doesn't have a microphone. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. That was great.
Thanks, guys. See you later.
Bye.
Bye.